smiley face. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. So I work at the wonderful Beads School with John, who you're all here to see. I'm an English teacher, and I also have a responsibility to help look after these extra lectures and masterclasses, which are labelled the 42 Club. That is sadly not the average age of the presenters. That number is a reference to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Douglas Adams, and it is apparently the answer to the mysteries of the universe, which I'm sure John Tewson will be sharing with us this evening. There's a few people with their hands up, which is very polite. If you're able to just put in the chat what it was you needed help with, we'll be very happy to try to assist you with that in just a moment. And I'm going to give you a brief introduction, and then very, very quickly we'll hand over to the legend that is John Tewson. So first of all, a very, very warm welcome to everyone who's made the effort to join us tonight. Welcome to all our Beads pupils who've come along. It's really good to see you here. Welcome to our families as well. Absolutely wonderful to have support from Beads families and teachers. And even more excitingly, perhaps, we have lots and lots of people from outside the Beads community. So you are very, very welcome as well. All of John's Zoo contacts and colleagues from different eras. If you just indulge me for a few seconds, I wanted to read a brief, a sentence or two really from the end of John's last book, which I think really shows his optimism. And he says, there is no doubt that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will be felt for years to come. Even in the short term, their enforced closure in 2020 and 2021 and the need to limit visitor numbers when open has led an enormously deleterious effect on many of our zoos. I have, as far as possible, tried to avoid mentioning the pandemic in the text of the book. And he essentially says this is because it will not only have been repetitive, but also somewhat disheartening. And I just think it was a wonderful, optimistic message at the end of the previous book. And now, a few years on, I think we're hopefully in a bit of a different world in terms of that, but also quite a different place geographically, which I'm sure John will tell us about a lot more in a minute or two. In terms of housekeeping, if you have anything you'd like to ask, please do use the chat and we'll compile all of your questions, and then at a suitable moment, myself or the amazing Mr. Abrams, one of our assistant heads, will pass those queries on to John. But without further ado, I think it's time to hand over to John Tewson.
Thanks very much, Joe, and thank you very much to everyone who has logged in on a Thursday evening. Joe was quoting something from the previous book there about COVID, and it feels a bit 3 years ago being on a big Google Meet, but hopefully it gives a chance for people from around the world to come along. And I'm very conscious of the fact that there are lots of different people here who are all coming from different contexts and different settings. So the first thing is to welcome you to the school. I'm speaking from a school, and the framework for this is a school setting. There is our lovely school from the sky. You can see we're in the Sussex countryside. And the most interesting bit of that school for me is just behind that big green astroturf where there are some trees. We have got our school zoo, and every school should have a zoo. I believe that very strongly. And we've certainly got a zoo. There's me working hard as a teacher, some publicity shot that was taken. When I was digging this out, I was quite glad to see on the board, for some reason, I was writing the word aardvark repeatedly. So even in an English lesson, we can get that in there. But as I say, it's the school zoo that is one of the highlights here for me. It's a wonderful facility. It's got some extraordinary different animals there. And I think it's a fantastic benefit for the young people who are at the school to be in a situation where they've got some of these wonderful creatures around them. And the chap at the bottom right and the top left there is our star species, the Grandidias vonsera from Madagascar, very, very rare animal. Only one other zoo in the world has any within it, and they are genuinely beautiful and fantastic. And what a privilege to be holding those animals here in Sussex. As Joe said, this is under the auspices of what we call the 42 Club, taken from Douglas Adams's The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a book I've never read, I must admit. But we have a program of different things going on under that umbrella. And the next one up for studenty people will be from Ezzy Pearson in November, talking about space and robotics. But we have got other matters this evening, and we're going to be talking about zoos, and we're going to be talking about German zoos, and we're going to be talking about Germany, and we're going to be talking about this thing, which is the newly arrived, delivered yesterday from the printer, rather fantastic, well, I think rather fantastic, but I would think that, wouldn't I, book about the zoos of Germany. Very, very long, detailed, and a bit more about that later on. But I'm always very conscious of the fact that when we're talking about zoos, there are some people who are asking that question: is it cruel? Is there something wrong with keeping animals in captivity? And that's a question that people have been asking for a long old while. Thomas Gillespie, who founded Edinburgh Zoo before the First World War, asked that very question in a book that he wrote in about 50 or 60 years ago. Is it cruel, he asked. And there's no doubt at all that bad zoos aren't good places for animals. That polar bear exhibit there, which is now fortunately long gone, provided a pretty grim home for the bears that live there. That was in Duisburg Zoo in Germany, still in use until the beginning of this century. A pretty grim place for the bears, a pretty grim place for the zookeepers who are working with them. And there's no doubt in my mind that for every reason, it was a horrendous part of that zoo. But when people talk about zoos being cruel, I often think back to this fantastic quotation from Gerald Durrell, where he pointed out that it's all very well criticizing things, but we should look instead to improve them and to make sure that they are better in the future, which is what he did, of course, with his zoo in Jersey, and what I think good zoos do throughout. And when people talk about zoos and the lack of freedom that animals have there, I think of the various other freedoms that animals certainly do have within zoos. Yes, their space may be constrained, but they have all those other freedoms that exist and allow them to live lives that are fulfilled and safe and comfortable. And I think anyone who's seen animals in the wild will know that often the wild is far from wonderful for those animals that are involved in it. In fact, the wild is often quite an unpleasant place for animals. Nasty, brutish, and short is the phrase that is perhaps the one that comes to mind. Personally, if I were a gelada, such as this fellow here, I think I'd rather be living in Rainer Zoo in Germany under fantastic conditions, well fed, well looked after, my medical needs seen to, than chancing it out in the wild in Ethiopia in his case. Or her case, actually. So people will disagree with that, and they might think that it doesn't matter what, if you're taking away an animal's liberty, that's a terrible thing to do. That's a matter of opinion, I suppose, and it's certainly not one that I would share. And I would argue that zoos, in fact, are essential. And there are 4 reasons which have often been put forward. In a way, it's a bit of a cliche, these 4 reasons that are put forward for why zoos are essential and the work that they can do. Research is perhaps one of the things that zoos claim, and some people might argue they claim it perhaps without much justification. But the fact is that each year in Biaza zoos alone, which are the zoos that are the recognised zoos in Great Britain and Ireland, 1,300 research projects undertaken in an average year. It's an extraordinary number of different pieces of work. And although some of those projects might be relatively low level in their ambition and in their impact, some of them won't be. And certainly the lessons that are learned in the zoos are often very, very helpful in the broader context. And I'll come back to research a bit in a second, but conservation is the one that people talk about a lot. And again, sometimes I think people oversell conservation, but nonetheless, there is no doubt at all that the work of these great people on the screen in front of you, Peter Scott in the top right, Gerald Durrell in the middle, and the Earl of Bedford at the bottom left, who perhaps was responsible for saving the beautiful Pear David's deer from China. They and many others of their time were instrumental in establishing the idea of zoos as places of conservation. But of course, those are all people from a long time ago. And one might say, is that still a thing? And of course, it is a thing. There are still huge numbers of species out there that owe their existence on the earth to the work that's done in captivity. And whether those are big, showy animals like the Arabian oryx, or something slightly less glamorous like the Chianti spray toad down at the bottom right there. There are species out there that do owe their continued existence purely to zoos, but more than that, and I'm using Great Britain as an example here, there are animals constantly being rewilded, and those animals come from captive stock. The bison that are being rewilded in Kent, not too far away from where I'm speaking at the moment, come from captive stock. The beavers that brilliantly have been re-established in the UK and are breeding, which is just wonderful, come from captive stock. Without zoos, without expertise of zoos, there wouldn't be those animals around to populate those reintroduction programs. And that, to my mind, is a fantastic and wonderful thing. But it's also worth remembering just how perilous the position of so many animals is in the wild. The okapi, the animal, I think for a lot of people, a lot of zoo people love the okapi. It's their favorite beast. Relatively common, but 10,000 or so in the wild, in a very perilous location as well. The ring-tailed lemur over on the left, a very, very, very familiar animal, but in the wild, only about 2,000 of them remaining. And in the middle, the Syrian bear, about 150 at most in the Middle East of that species. And a species that probably isn't going to hang on in zoos for that much longer. It's not a species that zoos are really focusing on, just because there isn't enough room, there isn't enough resources. And so the Syrian bear is one of those species that may disappear, beautiful and wonderful and incredible though it is. So the work of zoos to protect and preserve animals is crucial. But so too is the work of zoos when it comes to education, telling people about the animals that they're looking at, but more than that, helping people perhaps change the way in which they might live and go about their lives. And perhaps the most obvious things of those are through pedagogical material, such as that, or by talking about animals. There's a newspaper clipping showing a very handsome young me when I used to work in a zoo many years ago, going out and visiting some primary school and scaring them with a reticulated python, a royal python. So education clearly is something that zoos do really, really well. I don't know Eric Jensen, he's not someone I've got a personal connection with, but I love this idea that he puts forward here. Good zoos have the potential to deliver effective conservation-related learning outcomes. The positive impact has been shown. The valuable roles that zoos can play is clearly shown by the research. Well, good on you, Eric Jensen, for pointing that out. And I would say that even more basically and obviously than that, the joy and excitement that not just young people, I as not young people share that joy and excitement in spending time and being alongside animals is beyond comparison. There's something truly wonderful about that opportunity, as here at Leipzig Zoo in Germany with two young people enjoying the animals there. In the British book, I told a story about how once I was teaching a lesson about the play King Lear. It was a pretty boring lesson, to be perfectly honest. And suddenly outside the window, a sparrowhawk plummeted down to the ground, holding onto a pigeon that it had captured. And it spent about half an hour slowly killing this pigeon that it had knocked out of the sky but hadn't managed to quite kill. And for half an hour, me and my class were sitting watching this going on the grass outside our lesson. It was by far and away the most exciting English lesson I've ever had. This sparrowhawk here was one that came to my back garden and killed a pigeon, I think it was, earlier on this summer. And the reason I mention that is that the excitement and the thrill of being alongside wild animals, for me, is something that is universal. I've yet to find somebody who isn't excited by the wild animals that they might come across. Certainly when that sparrowhawk was killing its pigeon outside my classroom, there wasn't a person in the classroom, there wasn't a student who wasn't absolutely enthralled by what they were seeing. I suppose the obvious answer to that is, well, great, but surely people should go and see animals in the wild. And if they can, that's fantastic. That's brilliant if they can do that. But I would use the example of the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania, one of the great wonders of the world, a truly fantastic place, but a place that is swamped, frankly, by tourists, by visitors, that struggles to cope with those visitors, and yet is only receiving about 450,000 visitors a year. So if the Ngorongoro crater is already being swamped by 450,000 visitors a year, what do we say to the many millions of people who are visiting the world's zoos? who are visiting and seeing animals in that context. And in addition, I would say that when you go to the Ngorongoro Crater or anywhere similar, it's fantastic for your average visitor to be able to see herds of, in this case, wildebeest and zebra. But you're not going to see many of the smaller creatures. You're not going to see many amphibians. You're not going to see many small rodents. And if you do, you're likely to see them scurrying off and disappearing. So zoos are, to my mind, not better than or not worse than the wild, but they're different to the wild. The comparison I would use as an English teacher is like watching a film or watching a play. Or as a sports supporter, I'd say it's like going to see a football match or watching it on television. You get a different experience in either place, and both experiences are worthwhile and wonderful. And talking of television, that's the other argument that people will make. Why on earth do we need to have animals in captivity when we can see such fantastic TV shows done by these extraordinary people? And my answer to that would be, yes, television is fantastic, but for exactly the same reason that I do like to go to see a live football match rather than watch it on television. For exactly the same reason why I do like to visit London rather than just watch a documentary about London. I don't think television will ever fully replace the being in the presence of the actual living, breathing creature. And here's the director of Dublin Zoo, Christoph Schwitzer. Here's a great quotation from him, where he talks about the fact that it was going to Cologne Zoo as a child, spending time with the lemurs at Cologne Zoo, that turned him into the person that he is now. And Christoph, as well as being the director of Dublin Zoo, is one of the world's foremost experts on lemur conservation, and particularly this species, the blue-eyed black lemur of Madagascar. And what Christoph doesn't know about blue-eyed black lemurs probably isn't worth knowing. If that animal is going to be protected, his role in it is crucial. And that all began at Cologne Zoo when he was taken there by his mother in a pushchair. And the final reason, the one that perhaps people sometimes turn their noses up at, is recreation. And again, another great Gerald Durrell phrase. He talked about zoos sometimes being seen as a place to ride an elephant and get sick on ice cream. But I would broaden out the idea of what recreation represents. I don't think it is just about going and having a good time, although a good time can certainly be had. And instead, I would turn to, this isn't necessarily specific to zoos at all, but when Mind, the mental health charity, talked about the ways in which people can be helped to find well-being, they talked about us connecting, taking notice, giving, learning, and being active. In other words, all things that are absolutely connected with embracing the natural world, whether that's in a zoo or just in the countryside itself, or in anywhere where the natural world is flourishing. So to my mind, that ability to connect with the natural world is something that is absolutely beneficial to us all as human beings. And this fantastic quote, again, I don't know Paul Rose, but what a wonderful idea that he puts forward. The zoo is more than a place of entertainment. They allow us to experience nature, but they also bring many positive benefits to human mental health and well-being. And I make no apology for the fact that I would say that above all, zoos are for people. They're for us. They're for us to benefit from the wonderful chance to spend time with a lion-tailed macaque, such as this chap here, or whatever other species we are enjoying and seeing there. And certainly that's something that we found here with our school zoo. We surveyed the students, and I was a bit wary of surveying the students because I thought if they turned around and say they weren't particularly bothered by the zoo, I wasn't quite sure where that would leave us. But in fact, 70% of them said that they enjoyed the opportunity to spend time in the zoo and felt it was beneficial to their happiness. And 80% of those who were somehow involved said that they felt it gave them a greater sense of responsibility. So again, being with animals, spending time with animals was something which was hugely beneficial to them in all sorts of different ways. So I would reject that comment that Gerald Durrell put forward, that zoos were seen as that. And instead, I would say they're very much a place to be in touch with nature and with animals and making the world and its challenges a great deal more manageable and handleable. So zoos are clearly wonderful and fantastic places, and they've got a huge amount to offer. I'm now going to move on to the next section, where I'd like to talk about the book that I wrote a few years ago that Joe mentioned earlier on. There's me, looking a lot younger than I do now, at London Zoo. Some of you will recognise the old elephant and rhino pavilion at London Zoo. And I'm one of those people who was obsessed by animals and zoos from a young age. And partly that was the inspiration of, I mentioned him already, Gerald Durrell, Catch Me a Colobus, a wonderful book about going and catching colobus monkeys in Sierra Leone. And it absolutely struck a chord with me when I was younger, and I became obsessed. And then in the late 1970s, this book was published by a chap called Anthony Smith. And in it, he tried to describe, catalogue all of the zoos that existed in the UK at that time. And I was absolutely bowled over by this book. It was a book I read and reread again. I was so excited by all that it had to offer. I nagged my parents constantly to try and take me to some of these places that were featured in there. And it was a book that stayed with me for a long, long time. And as I got older, as I began to write myself, I realized it was something that I would very much like to produce a version of, inspired by Anthony Smith. And in the late 1990s, I did write something and hawked it around various publishers. And one or two were a little bit interested, but not really. And the book that they had in mind would be something that told you the entrance price and told you whether there was a cafe or not. And I wasn't really that keen on that. I was far more interested in the history of the aviary and the different species that have been featured in the reptile house and so on. And I ended up not writing it and instead going to work in Tanzania and East Africa, and then coming to work here at Beads and doing other things and having children. But still, at the back of my mind, there was this idea that that was a book that needed to be written. And this great quotation from the American writer Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winning Toni Morrison: if there's a book that you want to read and it hasn't been written, then you must write it. So that's precisely what I set about doing. And I was inspired not just by that previous book, but I was inspired by the music I like as well. So I am the sort of person who likes listening to really dodgy, jangly guitar music that is sometimes called indie music. And the reason it's called indie music, short for independent, is that the people who made that music would record it, design the sleeves, release it, sell it themselves. A sort of punk aesthetic of doing the job yourself rather than relying on someone else to tell you what to do. And that's what I was inspired by. And that's why we started producing some exciting things. So we produced a few guidebooks for zoos, such as those ones there. I gave it the rather perhaps pretentious title of the Okapi Press, partly because I said before I love okapis, and partly because I had this very nice logo that was drawn by a student I taught, called Grace Stannard, who designed that beautiful okapi, and got together and started producing this book. And there was one very, very crucial person in the production of this book, who is a chap called Alan Ashby, who is a designer, who has had a career designing all sorts of wonderful publications and not so wonderful publications. But Alan was absolutely fundamental in making the British Zoo book look smart and fantastic. And we released that a couple of years ago, sold out, and people seemed to quite like it, which was very, very edifying and very, very pleasing. And hearing people saying that it inspired them to visit some of the zoos featured was a really wonderful thing to have happen. So when that book happened, we were very, very excited by it, and it was a huge piece of work. And I was very, very grateful for all those people who bought it and took the risk of buying a copy. But then my thoughts started turning to Germany. And I'm going to just break away from zoos for a few minutes just to make a few general comments about Germany as a country. I'm fascinated by Germany, I must admit. So I was born in 1970, the year that the Beatles released their last studio album. And being born in 1970, that means that the end of the Second World War, 1945 obviously, was 25 years before I was born. In other words, the end of the Second World War was as near as Britney Spears' first album is to today. It was as near as the Millennium Bug is to today. In other words, the Second World War was really quite recent. It was really very, very recent. It was more recent than Tony Blair. It was more recent than France winning the World Cup. It was more recent than the film Toy Story, which to me still seems like a relatively recent film. It was more recent than any of those things. And I think that proximity of the war completely coloured the attitude of not just me, but I think a huge number of British people of my generation. So when I was at school, very, very popular reading were these sort of magazines with exciting stories of plucky Brits doing it to the terrible Germans. And when I would watch a film, it would often be a film in which plucky Brits, or plucky Americans in this case, were getting one over the terrible, evil, awful Germans. And certainly there was a very, very negative feeling towards Germany as a country and Germany as a place. And I was discussing this with an old school friend just last night, actually. And at my school, there were two people whose lives were made a misery because they were German. And people were horrid to them because they were German. And in fact, one of them was Dutch, and one of them was an American of German descent, but an American Jew of German descent whose family had left Germany some years previously. And yet, in the England of the 1980s, 1970s, and 1980s, even having a slightly German name was enough to encourage people to be desperately unkind to you. And I think that narrative plays out often in the way that sport is discussed. Very famous front page news story from 1996 when England were playing Germany in an important football match. And two of the players were mocked up, Achtung, surrender, an extraordinary piece of work. A few years previously, when England won the World Cup in 1966, the Daily Mail, a terrible newspaper, for those of you who aren't British, I wouldn't want you to judge Britain by the Daily Mail. But this extraordinary line that the Daily Mail famously came up with: if the Germans beat us at our national game today, we can always console ourselves with the fact that we have twice beaten them at theirs. So this thing of the war was hanging over so many people. In fact, I'd say it continues. Some of you might not realize this, but yesterday, the new England football manager was announced, and he's a German chap, Thomas Tuchel. I'm sure he'll be very, very successful. And the response of the press to this has been unbelievable. Three Lions gamble on a, in capital letters, German, says, again, the wonderful Daily Mail. So there is this negative attitude which has existed and still continues to exist towards Germany. And then I would tie that along by saying that Germany also then became a perhaps something that people laughed at. Fawlty Towers and Allo being two very popular comedy shows that featured German people. And perhaps for people like me, I'd look at the style of your average German and their taste in music. How could a country like the music of David Hasselhoff? How could they serve up food like this? That's a real German sausage, incidentally. That photograph taken at a zoo, no less. And how could they find the British culture? But they found Mr. Bean funny. This was clearly a terrible country that did terrible things and couldn't be trusted in any way at all. But there were other ways of looking at it, of course, as the Independent newspaper reported, actually in response to that terrible Achtung surrender headline, where they talked about Germany being a country that was wonderful. And I think for myself, even before then, I'd grown to start loving Germany as a place. Now, in part, I'd like to say that was in recognition of some of the wonderful things that came out of Germany, the wonderful architecture, both new and old, the fantastic engineering, some brilliant world leaders like Willy Brandt here, for example, a genuinely great human being. And it was partly those things, I suppose, but because I'm slightly shallow and judge things by zoos and football usually, it was also this chap who was a footballer called Pierre Littbarski, who played for Germany in the 1982 World Cup. And the German team at the time was filled with people with big perms and huge moustaches. And then you had Pierre Littbarski, who was skillful, didn't look like that, and had a slightly different attitude towards things, and made people like me begin, 12 years old at the time, begin to start questioning the way we might have seen this country before. And of course, as I then got older and realized Germany's instrumental role in the bringing together of Europe, and perhaps began to see that Germany was a country that did things well, perhaps that attitude changed. And I love this quotation, often quoted from Angela Merkel, when she was asked what was the best thing about Germany. And her answer was airtight windows. And that sense of, and those of us who perhaps, there are some people on this meeting who are German, and there are some of us who have spent time in Germany, that sense that things work there and are done properly by people who care about what they're doing is part of the reason why Germany is a fantastic country. It's not perfect, of course it's not perfect. My German friends will tell me how awful the railway system is in Germany, and most building projects seem to go on for about 25 times as long as they should. And on a more serious level, the rise of some fairly unpleasant political forces in Eastern Germany in particular is something about which to worry. But there are lots of things to celebrate about Germany, and some of those things are relatively trivial. Some of them don't really matter so much. The fact that great beer is produced there is a good thing, I suppose, but it's not the be-all and end-all. But there are lots of other things that I think are worth glorying in Germany, not the least of which is the way in which reunification was handled. It's quite interesting. The life expectancy in the former East Germany is now higher for men than it is in the former West Germany. Isn't that a fantastic and wonderful thing? That level of equality that exists within the country as a whole. But also, perhaps for the purposes of this evening, one of the most fantastic things about Germany are its zoos. And German zoos, I would argue, are the very best in the world. Some might put in a claim for American zoos. A few very deluded people might put in a claim for the zoos of the UK. They'd be wrong. And some people might suggest somewhere like the Netherlands or the Czech Republic has that claim. But I would argue most strongly that Germany does. So I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about Germany's zoos and what it is that makes Germany's zoos so fantastic. Germany was almost quite late to the zoo game in some ways. There were several zoos that were founded before Germany's oldest zoo in Berlin. In fact, there were others as well. These are just the zoos that still exist. But there were one or two zoos that have closed down. Bristol Zoo, most notably, perhaps. Manchester Zoo. But Berlin Zoo has got several that are older than it today. But once Berlin had been founded in 1844, there were a whole load more zoos that came piling in after it. In fact, one of the reasons why writing this book about the history of German zoos has been quite a long process is that so many of the zoos have got quite a long history. And culturally, they established themselves for all sorts of different reasons. Some of those reasons were to do with making money, undoubtedly. Some were as a symbol of civic pride, but often it was done, they were created in order to allow the growing populations, urban populations, to connect with nature, to reconnect with nature. And I think it's quite interesting that in Germany, the vast majority of zoos are still in cities, which absolutely isn't the case in the UK or in France, where most of our zoos are in the countryside. These were very much built for urban populations to benefit from them and to have the advantages of having animals amongst them. So there are lots of reasons why I would say that German zoos are great. They take themselves seriously. They're not trivial places. Along with many other, perhaps British zoo goers, I hate this time of year for zoos because every single zoo is selling itself as a Halloween destination. German zoos, not universally, but usually don't fall in for such folderol. They're much more scientifically focused. They're usually financed by the city or by the region. They're hugely well supported, hugely well visited by the German people. Often, they're incredibly, astonishingly beautiful. The zoos in places like Stuttgart, and Stuttgart Zoo is just one of the most beautiful parks you'll ever find anywhere in the world. And I think, too, there's a real pride and a genuine interest in looking after animals and presenting those animals to the public. There's less feeling, I think, amongst German zoo people that they have to somehow apologize for the fact that they enjoy looking after animals and they enjoy being with animals and they enjoy showing those animals off to the world. I think the levels of husbandry of those animals are often quite outstanding in German zoos, and we might look at one or two examples in a second. Visitors are really well looked after. Perhaps this goes back to taking themselves seriously as well. One of the things I like about German zoos is you can go to a German zoo restaurant and get your lunch and enjoy a nice beer with it. Whereas in a British zoo, because British zoos often seem to market themselves as being glorified playgrounds for children, the idea of having a beer would mark you down as being somehow rather suspect. And the other thing about German zoos, as I've already mentioned, is so many of them have extraordinary histories, extraordinary pasts, which are filled with interesting stories and interesting accounts of things that went on and things that reflect both their own experience, but perhaps the broader experience of Germany. And I'm going to talk about 3 zoos that I think stand out in very different ways. And the first of those is the place that, for me and for many others, is the greatest zoo on earth, which is the zoo in Berlin. Berlin actually has 2 zoos, 2 astonishingly good zoos. There's the zoo from the old East Germany, called Tierpark Berlin, which is a little bit out of the city centre. But slap bang in the middle of the city, right in the center of things, is Zoo Berlin. And what a wonderful entrance gate that is. What a wonderful portal to exciting things. How exciting does that look to be walking through there and coming in and seeing places like this, their new Rhino House, or this extraordinary pagoda that sticks up and can be seen for quite a distance around. Or the wonderful birdhouse filled with all sorts of different birds, a fantastic array of species. In fact, one of the things that's always marked Berlin out is that it's the zoo that has the greatest number of species of any zoo in the world. I'm not 100% sure that claim still holds true, but certainly historically that was the case. And I remember reading about this in the Guinness Book of Records when I was a young child and thinking, this is a place I'm desperately keen to see. And certainly when I look back, or when we look back at Zoo Berlin's history, we see a place that is absolutely rich in the history that it had. It was founded in 1844, and through the 19th century, it developed some truly beautiful buildings that perhaps in some ways shouldn't have worked. Why have a giraffe house that sort of has these strange stylistic details in it? Why have an ostrich house that's designed to look like a Egyptian temple? They shouldn't have worked, but they did work. And Berlin, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of this century, was a genuinely wonderful place with a fantastic array of animals that perhaps in many cases have never been seen in captivity since. This is a page from the book, actually, of some of the wonderful old species that were there at the turn of the century. This is taken from, these photos taken from a picture book that was published right at the beginning of the 20th century. And some of those extraordinary species that were there. So Berlin Zoo was a grand and wonderful place, and it was a zoo that had perhaps no equal ever for the size of its collection or for the richness of its beautiful facilities. It had a restaurant that was built in the early part of the century that could seat 10,000 people at one time. And the restaurant was so huge that it included a hair salon for the workers at the restaurant to use, so they could always look at their smartest when they were serving people. Quite an extraordinary scale. But then, of course, as is so often the case of German zoos, the war came along, and the war hit Berlin Zoo particularly badly, partly because it was located right in the middle of the city, and partly because right next door to it was this enormous flak tower, on the roof of which were mounted various guns to try and shoot down enemy planes. So the area became a target for Allied bombers as they attacked Berlin. And the zoo itself was devastated through the war, particularly in 1943 and 1944. And those beautiful buildings completely shattered and destroyed, in most cases beyond ever being repaired. In fact, by the end of the war, the animal collection of the zoo, which had started the war at there were 4,000 animals when the war started. By the end of the war, there were 91 animals remaining. And those many of those died shortly afterwards for health reasons, because clearly being in this situation was not good for anybody or anything. Animals were preserved. This is quite a famous photograph of looking after a shoebill, and this wonderful bird from Uganda. And what's quite nice about this photo is that the woman who's feeding that shoebill was a keeper called Elizabeth Johnst, who worked at the zoo for more than 50 years. And before her father worked at the zoo for more than 60 years. So a whole dynasty of keepers from the zoo. And there she is looking after this incredible bird, trying to keep it safe as the war drew to a close. In fact, the story of Berlin Zoo in the years after the war is what I find most incredible. So it was completely devastated. Berlin as a whole was completely devastated. And yet this incredible woman, Katharina Heinroth, took over the zoo and got it back on its feet, despite the fact that she had had a truly horrendous time of it. Her husband had been in charge of the aquarium at the zoo and had been incredibly ill. As the war came to an end, he was sheltering in a bunker. He wanted to take his own life because he was very close to death and was worried what would happen to him if he was captured by Russian soldiers. He wasn't able to do that. He died very, very shortly after. Katharina, as a woman by herself in Berlin, overrun by Russian soldiers, would have had a truly appalling time. And she was amongst the women who were clearing the rubble away shortly after the end of the war. But she managed to get herself into the position where she was placed in charge of what remained of the zoo. And slowly, by hook and by crook, she managed to get the place back on its feet, despite extraordinary setbacks. So that big flak tower wasn't fully destroyed. And shortly after the war, in 1947, they tried to destroy it properly, tried to blow it up to destroy it properly. And the effect of that was that the explosion was so vast that all of the work that had been done trying to sort out the zoo, trying to repair buildings, all of that was completely shattered by this new explosion. Roofs were blown off buildings, windows were smashed, and she had to basically start all over again. But she did. She worked with the animals that were there. A very famous hippo. I'm going to pronounce its name very badly. Apologies to any German people who are here. But Kanauchka, the hippo, who survived the war, would live for another 40 or 50 years in the zoo. She had fundraising and an Oktoberfest that took place every year to raise money, and she managed to get the zoo going and managed to get the zoo back onto its feet once more. The first elephant arrived in 1950, the first new elephant after the war, a present from the people of India and from President Nehru in the interest of world peace. There wasn't a house for it. It was put in a zebra stable, and she would then build a new elephant house. Extraordinary that the Berlin Zoo we see today grew out of effectively rubble that had been that was the consequence of the terrible attacks on Berlin during the war. And what an extraordinary testament to the people of Germany in general and Berlin in particular, that it, just as the country itself was able to do, was able to rebuild so spectacularly. And it really did rebuild spectacular. I love this photograph of a very old-fashioned looking rhino house in the 1960s. That's gone now, of course. You wouldn't keep rhinos like that these days. But what a wonderful example of the way in which this place was pushing forward. It was renovating old buildings. I love this beautiful little house here for wild pigs that still exists and was rebuilt after being destroyed in the war. And subsequently, a fantastic hippo house such as this is just one of very many stunning pieces of architecture that exist at Berlin Zoo. So I mentioned earlier on that Berlin Zoo was famous for having a huge number of species, and it still does. 142 different species of mammal kept there today, 245 species of bird. And just to put that in context, these are the equivalent figures for London Zoo. You can see there for yourself, the number of mammal species at London is less than half of what's to be seen at Berlin. The number of bird species, maybe about a quarter or so. Reptiles, less than half, and so on and so forth. And of course, keeping a huge collection of animals isn't necessarily a good thing in itself, and there can be problems with that. But Berlin do it tremendously well, and it's a great place. And the excitement of visiting that place is never, ever going to abate. So the second place I want to talk about is a very, very different place in a very, very different town, the town of Cottbus, which is about an hour and a half southeast of Berlin, just very close to the border with Poland. It's an extraordinary little town, actually, quite an interesting town, where because of the proximity to Poland, the road signs are also in Polish as well as German, and they're also in Lower Sorbian, which is a language spoken by about 7,000 people only. And the road signs there are all in that. So trilingual road signs, an extraordinary thing to come across. And the zoo in Cottbus is a fantastic place. It's in some ways, it's very low key. It's not a place that will feature on the itineraries of many visitors to Eastern Germany. But an extraordinary tale about its founding. So again, I'm going to insult Germans, I'm sure, with my terrible German pronunciation. But when the state of East Germany was formed, quite soon afterwards, there were uprisings and lack of content from the workers, which blew up in 1954 in particular, 1953, 1954, with the Volksaufstand, the uprising in East Berlin initially, and then spreading out through the country, where construction workers were pretty unhappy with the quotas that were being put on their work. About 100 people were killed, at least. Many thousands of people were imprisoned, and the authorities were genuinely worried about the status of the country. And so they decided that, as well as suppressing these people, they needed to provide them with something to entertain them and to keep them happy. And what better thing to entertain the population than a zoo? And Cottbus was a place where a zoo was decided it would be built. So this is in the spring of 1954. And the way in which this happened was nothing short of incredible. In the spring of 1954, it was decided that a zoo would be had. So on May the 27th, a chap called Heinz Petzold was a council worker, and he was charged with finding the right location for the zoo. And he was given a day to find the right location. He didn't need a day. By lunchtime, he had found the place where he thought the zoo should be. And by 6 o'clock that evening, on May the 27th, it had been agreed that this indeed would be the site of the zoo. The next day, at sunup, lots of volunteer workers were there to start cutting paths, getting rid of unexploded bombs from when the site had been bombed during the war, and putting up fences. And by the evening of the 29th, next day, animals were ready to be released into enclosures. Nothing very exciting, nothing very major, but nonetheless quite incredible. Some deer, some foxes. The next day, a cage was built for some foxes and a buzzard. And by the 31st, so less than a week after it had been decided that they would indeed build a zoo, by the 31st, all the people who had been working on this site were having a celebration meal, ready to open the door of the zoo on June the 1st. Quite incredible how quickly this was all put together. They had one exotic animal, a dingo. They had lots of local animals, and out of that grew a zoo which is, I would argue, today a really rather wonderful and rather beautiful place. Through the 1970s, it probably wasn't, to be honest, a particularly wonderful and beautiful place. There are some elephants you can see in the background, and they're not particularly appropriate house. But here's the thing I love about Germany and its attitude towards everything, I guess, but zoos are a microcosm of that, is they make sure they can do it better. They push hard, and in this case, to build a totally appropriate elephant house that's really rather nicely designed for a small herd of elephants, as you can see there. But meanwhile, at this place, Cottbus, they're specializing in all sorts of fantastic animals. Those marabou storks on the left-hand side are a species that aren't necessarily particularly easy to keep and breed in captivity, but at Cottbus, they've bred hundreds of them. They've absolutely cracked it. And that wonderful animal on the top right is a type of tapir, a lovely animal from Central America, Baird's tapir, which is very, very rarely seen in Europe, and they have them here at Cottbus, and they're fantastic. And it's an absolute privilege to be able to visit this wonderful zoo and see these extraordinary animals in what, frankly, is a very small town that most of us probably wouldn't notice in all sorts of different ways. And the last zoo I want to focus on, again, a very, very different story, is the zoo in Leipzig, which was founded by this rather splendid-looking chap here called Ernest Pinkert, who was a pub owner. He owned an inn, and he wanted to attract people to his inn, and so he did various things to attract them, had hot air balloon rides, for example, and in 1878, he opened up the Leipzig Zoo, as it is now, and it very, very quickly became a hugely popular place and a hugely successful place, not least because it bred lions like they were going out of fashion. So the first couple of cubs came along in 1881, and by the turn of that century, 200 had been born. And then through the 20th century, a barely credible 2,000 lion cubs were born at the zoo, alongside at the same time huge numbers of bears and hyenas and tigers and leopards and all sorts of different carnivores, kept in, frankly, accommodation that today we might regard as wholly inadequate. But nonetheless, the animals there flourished to an extraordinary extent. And Leipzig was a major player in the German zoo scene for many, many years. In fact, it was a really very successful place until it started having problems. And I think it's one of the reasons I wanted to bring Leipzig up as an example, is it shows that resilience, the resilience of this zoo in particular, but of the country as a whole. When the First World War came along, the zoo was crushed by it, crushed by the lack of food, crushed by the lack of money, crushed by the lack of staff. And the zoo director, there's his assessment of what he saw when he came back to the zoo after the war. And then in the years after the Second World War, Leipzig Zoo, in common with most zoos in the former East Germany, saw very, very little development until by the 1960s, it was basically falling apart. And there's a long quotation. This is from an internal memo which points to the poverty of the zoo as it existed at that time. The husbandry conditions for the animals are so inadequate that they are criticized by all who see them, said the staff at the zoo at the time. And the first time I visited Leipzig Zoo was in the early 1990s, and it was a pretty grim place, to be honest. This is an enclosure in the cat house, and there was a similar sized cage outside, but really just extraordinarily impoverished conditions for those animals to live in. That's relatively recently, early 1990s. Well, since then, things have changed to an extraordinary extent. I mean, a genuinely extraordinary extent, to the extent that Leipzig now is one of Europe's greatest zoos. It set out a master plan of what it was going to do, and it did it. And it developed in a way that makes it a wonderful and exciting zoo where all sorts of incredible things can be seen. Underwater viewing of an elephant's swimming pool is a fantastic and wonderful thing to be able to witness. An ape accommodation for apes, which is amongst the very best in Europe. A wonderful African savanna exhibit, as you can see here, with a restaurant overlooking it, so you can sit a rather delicious meal while you're watching giraffes and zebras and so on strolling around, and still lions, of course, still breeding lions, although in nowhere near the numbers that they did once breed them in. And then they've got this extraordinary walk-through tropical jungle house called Gondwanaland. There it is from the air. You can see how vast it is. It cost about 60 million euros to build, and it's brilliant. It's a genuinely fantastic place. So Leipzig, I think, works, and it's hugely popular amongst its local population, but it works because it shows an ambition and it shows a desire to do things well. People recognize the value of having a facility like that in the city like Leipzig, right in the middle of the city, and they were prepared to put in the investment that was required, the effort that was required, and as a consequence, they built a zoo of which that city and that region can be, and that country, in fact, can be enormously proud. And I love the fact that there is that commitment to a zoo with public money being spent on it in a way that I think any British zoo would look at and feel only jealousy, because there is no British zoo, sadly, that receives anything like that level of public money in order to go on and do exciting and wonderful things. So German zoos are great. We've talked about the desire to write. And so what was the genesis of this German zoo book that came along? So as I've made plain, I think, I've always loved Germany. Well, I've loved Germany since I was old enough to have an intelligent opinion. And the German zoos are great, but there are an awful lot of them. Depending on how one defines a zoo, but well over 1,000 collections of animals of some sort in Germany. Now, some of those will be domestic animals, some will be farm parks or a collection of doves in a public park or something, but nonetheless, a vast number of zoos that we needed to somehow knock down to a manageable number to cover in the book. So I chose perhaps the slightly arbitrary figure of 40, and failed. So in fact, it's 42 we've covered 42 zoos in the book. We tried to pick out the 42 that were perhaps the most notable, the most interesting, and had the best stories to tell. And then we've cheated by squeezing in a whole load more. So there's about 55 or 60 zoos that are in fact covered and discussed in one way or another in the book. And I'm very lucky that I've spent the last 30, 40 years developing quite a big library of zoo books of one sort or another. So being able to turn to, in this case, lots of annual reports from Rostock Zoo, and be able to use Google Translate to painstakingly translate them page by page to start piecing together the histories of these zoos was a hugely enjoyable task over the last several years. I was also helped hugely in doing this by lots of really, really important friends. This absolutely wasn't in any way at all a solo task, far, far, far from it. And two people in particular who I think are both here this evening, actually, have been massively helpful. So the chap on the left with the zebras, the guy I mentioned earlier on, called Alan, who has the twin skills of being a designer, but also being someone who is passionately interested in animals and zoos and the exciting history of zoos. So Alan has worked to an extraordinary extent, putting the book together, making it look fantastic, finding wonderful images and making it as good as it possibly can be. And then the chap patting a whale on the head next to him is Rob, who comes from Shrewsbury in the west of England. And Rob is again somebody who is hugely involved in the world of zoos and has been painstaking in fact checking, sense checking, and adding to and advising and making sure the book is as good as it possibly can be. So the quality of the book is very, very much down to those two, but also to lots of other people who have been hugely helpful. And here are a few of them: various zoo directors, people who are involved in zoos in one way or another, zookeepers, zoo historians of one sort or another, who have been massively helpful. The chap with the camel is the director of Heidelberg Zoo, for example, in Germany. The chap with the lanyard on over on the left-hand side is the director of Rheine Zoo in the northwest of Germany. And the other people there are various people who are involved in zoos in one way or another, all of whom have been hugely supportive. I was also very lucky, I hope you don't mind me being self-indulgent and mentioning this, but I was also very, very lucky to have my family, my wife and my family being massively supportive and allowing me to disappear and spend hours upon hours upon hours upon hours translating every single piece of information I could find about the history of Magdeburg Zoo in order to make sure that it was covered as fully and as accurately as it possibly could be. So a huge team of people working on the book and making it as good as it possibly could be. We spent a long time thinking about what the cover would look like. That was our first draft for the cover, featuring this extraordinary animal, a bear, Cuscus, at the top there. He's in the zoo in East Berlin in Germany, but we didn't feel it was quite right. It didn't quite work for us. We weren't quite sure that having that boat from Leipzig Zoo, it just looked like a boat. It didn't necessarily look particularly zooish. So in the end, we settled for this as our front cover. This wonderful gelada, primate from grass-eating primate from Ethiopia. In this case, he comes from the zoo in Chemnitz, right in the southeast of Germany. And then a nice selection of pictures at the bottom, a historical picture of an elephant seal in Hamburg, the Rhino Pagoda in Berlin, wonderful piece of architecture. And because we wanted an animal that wasn't a fluffy mammal, a nice weaver bird, in this case from Rhino Zoo in Germany. So we spent ages trying to make sure that the cover was good, and we spent ages trying to make sure that the inside was good, and I spent ages trying to make sure that people knew the book was coming. And so establishing a nice community of people out there who were following its progress and getting very, very impatient when it didn't come out as quickly as it should have done. I perhaps started talking about it rather sooner than I should have done. As a result, people have been very, very needing to be very patient, and I'm very grateful to them that they have been. So we've kept that going. We've kept trying to get people interested in the book, and very, very gladly they have now arrived. There I am posing with them, just arriving very, very recently, and they're now being sent out to the world. It's not I make no apology for the fact that it's not a cheap book. It does cost £44, because publishing something that is that hefty isn't a cheap thing to do. And it's not for people who have got a passing interest, perhaps. It is a pretty meaty old text. But always I was very, very conscious of the fact when we were writing it and when we were putting it together that it's highly unlikely that anybody's ever going to publish an English language history of a lot of the places that are featured in this book, not just the small and obscure zoos, but even zoos like Frankfurt or Cologne, which get 1.5, 2 million visitors a year. I'm not sure that anyone's ever going to write an English language history of them ever again. And I wanted to make sure it was as accurate and as well put together as it possibly could be. So I'm hoping that when people get the book, and they're going to start getting it very, very soon, I'm hoping they're going to like it. I'm hoping they're going to enjoy it. And I'm hoping they're going to find it as interesting as I have found it to put it together. So thank you very, very much for listening to me waffle on for the last hour. Now, hopefully, a chance to hear some questions, and maybe some other people might have something to say. And thank you very much for all the nice things that people are waving at me there. And I'm going to pass over to Joe Curtis, if he hasn't fallen asleep, to take the reins. Joe, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much. You're getting a huge round of applause there digitally, John. I don't know if you can see that, but it was just a stunning speech. We have a lot of these, in school, and that was one of the best we've had. So we're really, really grateful, John. Just a little bit of housekeeping. There's some pupils from the school here. Thank you so much for coming, and we hope you enjoyed that as much as the adults listening to John did. Pupils, please feel free to go now. You've had a long, long day. It won't be impolite in any way if you head off, and we'll see you tomorrow, unless you have some questions, but otherwise, if you feel the need to go, that's absolutely fine. On the other hand, if you are someone who's known John for a long time, if you've got some questions for John, there is no hurry whatsoever. We're here to take some questions and for catch up with John and everything. So you're very, very welcome to stay, and there's no rush at all. So in terms of what people have been putting in the chat, there were a couple of observations early on from either from two unknown people or from the same unknown person. I'm not entirely sure.
I think that's the same unknown person, Joe. It's a chap called Doug who is here. I think he is still here. Who's judging by the things that he's put there, he's a chap who knows. He is a chap who knows what he's talking about, and is heavily involved in the zoo world.
Did you want to comment on the increase in space resources for the Syrian brown bears?
That's a species, as Doug himself will tell us, there are lots of different species of bear and subspecies of bear, and the Syrian is one that perhaps hasn't necessarily attracted the zoo focus. But Doug, if there's more interesting stuff, do tell. That'd be interesting to hear.
Well, is my microphone on? Yes. I just came back from Leipzig, where they held this year's EASA conference, and at the bear tag meeting there was some discussion about Syrian bears, brown bears, and identifying animals that are in some collections that are just on the edge of EASA. So I think there's a real move to actually make up for the gap. I mean, it was a species that was commonly killed. London Zoo kept and bred them. Quite a number of collections in the UK has had them historically. But you are quite right about their status in the wild, and it's probably one that there should be a great deal more focus upon, particularly in a European context.
And the thing that Doug's pointing to there, which perhaps non-zoo people might be surprised at, is the number of species that zoos, I wouldn't say they have to give up on, but they just haven't got the resources. There are so many different species out there that sometimes the focus does need to be on a small number of species, and other ones, unfortunately, don't necessarily get that focus. Joe.
Thank you. And then the next observation is that it's a northern white rhino behind the slightly younger John in one of those.
And as some of you will know, that's a species that is functionally extinct now. So, yeah.
Now, a few people are putting their hands up. If you'd be so kind as to just pop a question in the chat, it's much easier for us to manage. But it's very polite putting hands up. It's all very civilized. The next question is from Thomas Collard. You're very welcome to unmute and ask your question. Thank you for waiting.
Hiya, lovely to see everyone and hear your kind of thoughts on the book and everything, John. My question is, I guess looking back to your first book that you did on zoos in Great Britain and Ireland, is there a German zoo that you think is especially British, and then vice versa? Is there a British zoo that you think is especially German? Yeah, I'd love to hear what you think.
That's a fantastic and very nerdy question, which is wonderful. Well, I think there are a couple of zoos that are quite British in some ways in Germany. So Dresden Zoo, which is a truly superb and wonderful place, to my mind, feels like a British zoo should be. It feels like Bristol would be, or London, Bristol before it closed down, or London would be if it was a bit better. It's a beautiful garden. I think it's the sort of place that people from overseas refer to as an English garden, with lots of nice things that you wander around, and it's all very beautiful with nice houses dotted around it. So it's got that traditional view. I think if I'm going to be positive about British zoos, I would say the thing that we do really, really well in the UK is make do with not very many resources and put things together that are sometimes a bit homespun, not necessarily beautifully built architecturally, but work. And I think there are one or two German zoos where they've had, out of necessity, they've had to do that, and they've done it very, very well. So, for example, the zoo in Neuwied, which is a great place, I really recommend it very, very wholeheartedly, not one that's often visited, is a place that's done things relatively inexpensively compared to some of those fantastically expensive things that we see at Berlin or Leipzig. And it does them really very well in a way that does remind me of a smaller British zoo. Flipping it the other way around, are there any British zoos that have the classic German attention to detail and quality? I'm not sure there are in the same way, for that reason of German zoos being so city-based and so built up. We don't really have that so much in the UK. If I was to broaden out the definition of the UK to include places that were previously in the UK 100 years ago, I might include Dublin. And I would say that Dublin is the one place that perhaps has that quality. And Dublin, of course, has a German director at the moment, and previously a Dutch director. And it does have that same sense of quality and that same sense of doing things really, really well. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you. We have a couple of comments from Joe Brand. In a supportive audience, I think Joe is possibly the most supportive. So thank you so much, Joe. Loads of positive feedback from Joe, really helpful at the beginning. So thank you. The next question is from, and please excuse the pronunciation, I think it's Michael Longmuir, if I pronounced your name correctly. I'm just going to read out Michael's question. Hoping to plan a trip to Germany next year. Is there a particular area or city that's ideal if you want to visit multiple zoos, or any zoo that is a must-see? And Michael's also complimenting you on your wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you, Michael. I think, gosh, there's a lot of people here who I know who have spent a lot of time visiting a lot of German zoos, and there's also a lot of people here who are from Germany, and everyone will have a slightly different opinion, perhaps. I would always point towards the Ruhr Valley, where there's a whole string of fantastic places, which are all really, really different as well. So in places like Dortmund, Duisburg, a fantastic aquarium in Düsseldorf, and Gelsenkirchen, all of these have got really interesting zoos that are really worth seeing, and each have their own character and their own personality and their own flavour. But, and it's a bit of a boring answer because it's a really obvious answer, the city of Berlin it's the best city on earth. And the reason it's the best city on earth is because it's got two best zoos on earth slap bang in the middle of it. And then within an hour or two's train journey, it's got a whole host of other fantastic zoos as well. And if you're in Berlin, it's not even that far to head down to Prague in the Czech Republic, or to head over to Wrocław in Poland and see great zoos there as well. So I would say probably the Ruhr Valley, but you'd have to really struggle to improve on Berlin as a place to go to. And both of the Berlin zoos are so rich in history in very, very different ways that they're really certainly worth seeing.
Thank you. The next question is from Jordan Varley. I appreciate the workload and the resources which must have gone into this book and the previous one, but would you look into doing a Czech Republic Netherlands book in the future?
Blimey, Jordan. But yeah, possibly, who knows? Czech Republic, the zoos in the Czech Republic and Poland are lovely, and I love the Czech Republic as a country, and I love Poland even more as a country, and it would be an honour and a privilege to write about those places. But gosh, there's an awful lot of research to do, and let's see. I've got a whole load of boxes of, in my house is filled with boxes of this book at the moment, which I need to get rid of. I don't think my family will thank me. The cats certainly won't thank me for every cat sleeping place in my house has now got a book filling it. So I think it'll be a long time before I can turn my thoughts to other things. But it'd be nice if people were interested in a book on the Czech Republic, or indeed on the Netherlands and Belgium. That would be a wonderful thing to do as well. I'm only 54 years old, so hopefully I've got a few years left to go. So yeah, who knows what the future will bring.
Thank you. And then Rob Vaughan's just complimenting Thomas's wonderful question. Then Ross Meredith, thanks, John. I thoroughly enjoyed your UK Zoo book and as a result discovered the likes of Hamerton. Similarly, in your sneak preview snippets ahead of the German book, I recently enjoyed and visited Chemnitz, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. So thank you for your enthusiasm and commitment. What's next? Key zoos of Europe, and then is it Piari Diazza? Is that an Italian zoo?
No, it's a Belgian zoo, which I hate. But that's a whole other story. I love Belgium, I hasten to add, but I'm not so keen on Paradise, a strange zoo where animals are kept in temples and things, very odd. Yeah, same thing. Maybe, who knows what the future will bring, but it's so nice that Ross says that about seeing places that he'd not heard of. And certainly some of the places here, I think anyone who's interested in zoos knows how great Leipzig is or how great Berlin is or whatever. But I hope people will also see how great some of the smaller zoos are. Neuwied, I mentioned Rainer in the northwest of Germany. It's a genuinely beautiful and fantastic place, which I hope people would perhaps be pushed towards by reading about it, as well as some of those smaller zoos, Cottbus, which we mentioned, Chemnitz, the former Karl Marx Stadt in southeastern Germany. So these are great places that maybe people won't necessarily have come across before.
Thank you. And then Douglas is offering more words of wisdom. The Allied bombing in World War II may have allowed German zoos to develop the way they have. Also, some zoos are making an error to deride the idea of a species-rich collection. And Douglas is happy to expand. I think we'd love to hear a little bit more from Douglas on that.
And just for those who aren't aware of this, there's a thing where dinosaurs like me, and maybe like Douglas as well, are criticised by some in the zoo world for liking lots of different species. And some people think that that's bad to have lots of different things. And Douglas, as a zoo professional of many years standing, I'd certainly be really interested to hear what your view is of that.
As far as the first point, which some people might find a little bit bizarre, particularly in the case of Berlin, as you pointed out, I mean, the zoo was leveled, and which was the case for many of the city zoos, which were in Europe, are often smack dab next to the train station, which was always going to be a target for Allied bombing. And so because they had clean sites, they were able to build new buildings. And so when you visited zoos in Germany in the 70s, they were the modern zoo world. And Britain was still backward because most of our zoos never really got touched. The odd bomb here and there, but nothing. There was no carpet bombing that took out zoos of any substance in the UK. So, in a bizarre way, the Allied bombing probably benefited the evolution of German zoos. As far as the species-rich idea is concerned, I mean, if one looked at places like, if you looked in the gazetteer of the Zoo Yearbook, for example, and there was a handful of zoos that hovered around the 200 mammal species, and that was the Bronx, San Diego, Zuberlin, and London, and comparably large numbers of animals in other classes, and they were hugely well visited, enormous visitor numbers. And I was at a meeting a year or so ago where a director of a very significant UK collection, when I commented about an issue, and he said that, well, you don't really have to have that many animals in a zoo. And I didn't get a chance to respond. The most economically viable, the most exciting zoo in this country is Chester, and it is also the most species diverse. Everywhere you go, there are animals, and I think even if you're running the zoo as a business, having a big collection of animals translates into large visitor numbers, and I don't know how they missed that trick.
Well, so as a parent, looking for a day out with children, certainly if I go to a zoo with when my children were younger, I'd want to see things. And I think it's no surprise you mentioned Chester, but also Colchester in this country and one or two others, the brilliant Cotswold Wildlife Park, that do have a sufficient number of animals to see rather than things that can't be seen and aren't so interesting. Thanks, Doug. Joe, can I do your job for you? Can I ask Leszek what his question is? Leszek's got his hand up. Oh no, Leszek's disappeared. So I'm showing why I shouldn't do your job for you, because I was about to ask him what his question is, but he's not there anymore. So back over to you, Joe.
Thank you. I think what would be really helpful is if people putting their hands up, if you can just pop the question in the chat, because otherwise I'll be jumping backwards and forwards and I'm bound to forget somebody. But thank you for these wonderful questions. So lots of people saying thank you to one another, which is just lovely to see. And then the wonderful Annie Bonner has asked a question, which is how do French zoos compared to German zoos?
And Annie is asking that question because she herself is French. French zoos are interesting. They used to be truly dreadful, I would say. And for a long while, France was really, really low down on the Zoo League table. And it had a couple of interesting places, but lots of real ropiness. It does have the second oldest zoo in the world in Paris, which is a truly stupendous and brilliant and fantastic place, and it's got another very nice zoo in Paris as well, which was recently completely rebuilt and is very pleasant. But increasingly in France there are private zoos, a bit like British places, that have sprung up across the country, which are often very focused on providing a good day out, lots of animals that are nice to see, somewhere nice to eat, often in the middle of nowhere, but in touristy areas perhaps. And as a consequence, France has increased its attractiveness as a zoo country. And it, again, going back to what we were saying earlier on about British zoos being quite good at making something out of nothing, I think that's something that French zoos often excel at as well. So there's a lot of really interesting places in France that have become a great deal more interesting over the last 20 or 25 years. It's still, though, and I'm sorry, Annie, but I think I would say, others might have a different view, but I would say that France still lags a long way behind Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, Belgium, Netherlands, and other places that are perhaps the absolute Switzerland, other places that are very, very good for zoos. It's quite good.
Philip Treneman was especially impressed with your points on the French zoos there, John. Our next question is from Jane Savage, to the wonderful Dr. Savage, just thanking you for your service to animals. Lots and lots of praise from Malcolm Huckvale, from Michael from earlier. David Howlett had a comment on the cat, saying the cats will enjoy all the eventual empty boxes.
They absolutely already are, actually, David. That's good.
And again, Jordan just expressing gratitude. Charles Adams has a question. Really love the picture of the Vontira yawning. One thing I love to see when visiting British zoos is how the public can engage, interact and learn about the animals. Is there a German zoo which stands out for public engagement?
That's a brilliant question. Thank you. And Charlie is... people might not know, Charlie is one of our zookeepers here at Beeds, and the reason he is praising that photograph of the Vontira yawning is that he took it himself, and it was a great photo. It's a really interesting question. I think until fairly recently, I would say most German zoos on the whole weren't anywhere nearly as good or as innovative as perhaps British or American zoos are, with the way in which they presented themselves in terms of pedagogical material, interesting signs, interesting things to do, and so on. Increasingly, I think that's happening, and inevitably it's often the zoos that have got the bigger budgets that are really, really good at it. The signs and the opportunities to learn and interact and engage at places like Cologne, Leipzig and Berlin are genuinely wonderful. And for somebody like myself who is shamefully lacking in the German language as a skill, it can be a bit frustrating because there's so much wonderful stuff to read and engage with, and one isn't always able to do so as a non-German speaker. But certainly there's a far increasing focus on that, and it's a slightly dull answer. And I'm personally, Leipzig isn't my favorite zoo in any way at all, but I think the way in which Leipzig recognizes the needs of the public is something that stands out. And certainly when it was at its lowest ebb and a new director came in and the early part of this century, late part of last century, he emphasized the importance of looking after visitors, and in emphasizing that and recognizing the centrality of visitors to the success of the zoo, he was able to succeed in engaging their interest.
Thank you very much, John. We have a question from Tom Lilly, who's one of the pupils at the school, who is still awake and is also an incredible pupil for people who know Tom. So thank you so much for your question. Tom's question is, what is your favourite animal you've ever seen in a zoo and why?
So it's a very easy answer. It's not a particularly rare, well, it's rare-ish, but my favourite animal always to see in a zoo is a thing I mentioned earlier on, an okapi, because it's an astonishingly beautiful animal. It's related to the giraffe. It's got a fantastically interesting backstory to it, that it wasn't known by Western scientists until the early part of the last century. And the first specimens of it, the first specimens of dead okapi, were found by a British diplomat who was working in Uganda, who went into what's now the Congo after dealing with some slave traders, and he was repatriating people who were being traded as slaves, taking them back to the Congo where they'd come from, and he came across the hide and the bones of this incredible animal, and it's a genuinely beautiful, slightly mysterious animal, very gentle. If one is very, very fortunate and is able to go in with them in a zoo, they're always beautiful to touch and to be close to, and there's just something a bit special about them. And they're in a few zoos here and there, maybe about a dozen zoos around Europe, but not a huge number, but they're always fantastic to see, and that fantastic charisma that they have is great to behold. So the okapi is the answer. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. And Michael's just added another comment to show appreciation for the first book and using it as a checklist really to visit as many places as possible, especially smaller zoos. Then Thomas Collard has another question. Is there a German zoo that is now closed that you'd have included if it were still going?
Not really, to be honest. I think there are fewer, because German zoos on the whole are not owned privately. There's fewer of them coming and going than is the case here in the UK. There are one or two that have gone historically. I mean, we cover one or two that have gone from way back when. So the Dusseldorf Zoo, which disappeared in the war and was never able to be rekindled, for example, we've got something about that in the book, and various other places that have vanished for one reason or another. But on the whole, I don't think there's any great lost zoo in Germany that isn't included. There is one zoo that we didn't include that in retrospect I sort of wish we had, which is a big safari park, Hudenhagen Safari Park, which probably should have been included. And I just didn't include it because we had to draw a line somewhere. And alas, that one fell by the wayside. But in terms of lost places, not really. So yeah, I think whereas in the UK, huge numbers of lost places that are sadly no longer with us.
Thank you. The next question is from Kevin Bucksteins, I think is the pronunciation. What would be your favourite collections in Belgium and the Netherlands? Just call me Kevin B. Don't try to pronounce my last name. It's a bit late for that, but thank you very much anyway.
So you should read the questions first, Joe. It's a very good question. So we mentioned earlier on this slightly strange zoo, which gets huge numbers of visitors and spends huge amounts of money, which I'm not particularly fond of. Whereas a bit further north of that is the zoo in Antwerp in Belgium, which is it's got a lot of building work being ongoing at the moment, which is making it not perfect at the moment. But that aside, I would say Antwerp Zoo is as close as perfection on earth as you will find anywhere outside Berlin. And then if one goes a bit north into the Netherlands, the zoo in Amsterdam, Artis Zoo, which again is a beautiful historical zoo with a fantastic setting, some wonderful old buildings. It's on a canal, obviously, it's in Amsterdam, and you can sit and eat a delicious meal while looking at wonderful animals and think you're in heaven. Actually, so those two, I'd say Amsterdam and Antwerp, are both fantastic, but there are also, particularly in the Netherlands, there are a few smaller places which are really interesting and doing all sorts of slightly quirky, slightly weird things, a bit like some British zoos actually, which are always a pleasure to go to.
Thank you. And this next one's more of a comment than a question, but Ross Meredith chuckled as you mentioned.
Joe is frozen momentarily. Is he going to come back?
Am I back?
You're back. You're back. Yeah.
Everyone can breathe again. So did Ross Meredith, is that where you were with me and then you lost me? So chuckled as you mentioned UK Halloween themed zoos. I enjoyed a trip to Yorkshire Wildlife Park today. Not a great fan of the now ever present meerkats, but their enrichment today with cardboard Halloween characters was too much.
Yeah. Well, and Yorkshire Wildlife, of course, is a fantastic and wonderful place. Start cardboard Halloween. Yeah.
The next question is from Naya Joachim. What a brilliant talk. Thanks, John. I know you've researched each of the collections in great depth, and I'm excited to see the results of your tremendous efforts. Is there a particular zoo that you now view in a significantly different light based on your research?
Thank you. And Naya is actually, I think, as he is listening in, he's actually at the San Diego Zoo today. So he is listening in from one of the world's great zoos. It's a very interesting question, and I think I'm not going to make it a specific thing, but a more general thing that I would say my respect. I hope I gave you the sense that from being old enough to be aware of such things, I've loved and had a respect for Germany. But that respect for Germany and the respect for what so many places had done in overcoming so many challenges, the sorts of things that Douglas was talking about earlier on, of being completely flattened, the respect for some of the individuals who were involved in that, the respect for the communities that came together to make sure that their community had the facility and the resource that they wanted. That was the thing that really hit me. And time again, it was quite humbling reading about and learning about some of these places that were doing such things and getting it together. And I can't even begin to imagine what it must be like to be having to start from scratch across the board, and to be able to do that and at the same time to get things going in that way was quite incredible, I think.
Thank you, John. The next question is actually a tripartite, three questions from Matthias Kelch. Thank you for the great presentation, John. In your opinion, which German zoo has changed the most positively in recent years, and which has changed the most negatively? That's the first question. Is there a zoo you're particularly excited to see develop further? And finally, when can we expect to hold the new book in our hands?
Really interesting questions from Matthias. So I think the positive change, there are lots of places that have changed really positively, and I think often it's zoos in the former East Germany where perhaps resources weren't what they might have been in the past, and over the last 20-25 years they've had the opportunity to grow and develop as a consequence. So Leipzig's been mentioned a lot, but in other places, Dresden, Magdeburg, Rostock, all sorts of really exciting things being undertaken. And I think that's great to see. And I'd also say that quite a few zoos in the west of Germany have improved massively. And perhaps the one that I would say has improved the most is in the city of Stuttgart, in the southwestern part of Germany, which previously had always had beautiful grounds, beautiful gardens, but was dominated by some fairly hideous concrete architecture. And it's now moving in a really genuinely rather fantastic way, and producing really wonderful settings for its animal collection to be seen. In terms of the most negative change, I'm going to give an answer which I'm sure many people would completely disagree with, which is the zoo in Hanover, the city of Hanover in the middle of Germany, which was in many ways a fairly traditional German zoo, and had a fantastic collection of antelopes, and was probably a bit dull in lots of ways and needed to be freshened up. And about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it had a huge amount of money spent on it, and it's now become a much more heavily themed, Disney-fied sort of a place, with boat rides and set dressing, and lots of people seem to love it. And to me, it's naff beyond measure, and I really can't find any liking for it whatsoever. Seeing polar bears kept in something that looks like an Alaskan village, or seeing African animals kept with a a wall that looks like it's falling down, because all walls in Africa are falling down, aren't they? It's just, I find it patronizing and absurd, and I really dislike it. And I really dislike it all the more because Hanover was previously an interesting historical place that could have moved in different directions. And most of all, I dislike it because it's really successful, which shows that I'm wrong and other people are have got different tastes, which is, how dare they? So yeah, so that's that. Place excited to see develop further. It's always interesting. There's quite a few zoo directors that are changing in Germany at the moment, different people coming and going. So it's interesting to see what new people will do. And the 2 Berlin zoos are changing and developing in interesting ways. We'll see if it's for the positive ultimately, but really very, very exciting to see what's happening there. And in terms of when you can get the book in your hands, if you are in mainland Europe, hopefully I'm going to be coming over to Europe next week to send them from Europe, because thanks to brilliant Brexit, sending things from the UK to Europe means that European people have to pay import duties. And I didn't think anyone would be too happy to suddenly have to pay £20 of import, 20 euros of import duty when they got the book. So I'm bringing them over to Belgium, hopefully next week. And Jan, who is on this call, is massively helpfully said he's going to help me post them and send them off. So we should be getting them off to European people, hopefully then. And UK people, I'll be sending them over the next couple of weeks. The first 10 copies disappeared off today. Yeah, that's that. Thank you for those questions, Matthias.
Thank you, Matthias. So the next question is from Malcolm Huckvale. John, you mentioned that people may think the US has the best zoos in the world. I haven't been to many, but surely European zoos are better.
Surely they are. I think American zoos, there are lots of great things going on in American zoos, and above all, there's a huge amount of money there. I'm very interested in the football shirt that Malcolm's wearing. And I've been, it's not a Southampton shirt, is it, Malcolm, by any chance?
No, it's Union Berlin, especially for the call.
Oh, fantastic. For a terrible
German team.
Southampton, but Union Berlin is certainly more than acceptable.
Thank you.
So I think the American zoos that I know well tend to be the really good ones, because those are the ones I focused on in California, Chicago, New York, Ohio, and there are some great things going on there. Are they to my taste? Not always, I've got to be honest. But visit the Reptile House at Los Angeles Zoo, for example, or the aviaries at San Diego Zoo, and you won't find, or the Mouse House at Bronx Zoo, and you won't find anything better anywhere, really anywhere. But there are also things that I must not, on a personal level, I'm not overly excited by, but are nonetheless quite impressive. But on a personal level, I prefer European places, I must admit.
Thanks, John.
Sense of history more than anything else.
Thanks very much for that question, Malcolm. Next is, I think, seems like quite a specialist question from Oliver Flory. Would love to hear your opinion on the Northern White Rhino artificial insemination project at Tierpark Berlin.
Gosh, I must admit, I know very little about the White Rhino insemination project at Tierpark Berlin, and Oliver is someone I know away from this call, so he and I might perhaps go offline with that one, I think, because that might not necessarily apply to lots of people who are here, apart from the fact that I would be pretty ignorant on what I'd be saying.
Thank you. So maybe, Oliver, you could catch up with John about that one later on. The next question is from Ray D. Have you done any sort of rough calculation of how many hours, days you spent in German zoos prepping for the book?
Not enough, and a lot. And a lot, most of the research actually was spent sitting at my kitchen table, as I say, translating documents, working my way through them. And then I think Alan, the designer, Alan Ashby, has spent months laying this thing out and designing it and producing it to make it look fantastic. And so it has been a huge, going back to the idea of not getting no publisher would have ever been the slightest bit interested in a book that was that labor intensive, given ultimately the size of the market for it. So it is very, very much a labor of love. And it's not something, the students I teach, when I say I've got a book coming out, inevitably their first question is, how much money are you going to make out of that? And the answer is that if it pays for itself, I'm delighted. It's not there to make money. It's there because it's the greatest pleasure I can imagine is spent pottering around Duisburg Zoo or reading about Dortmund Zoo's history or whatever it might be, or talking with people from those places. So yeah, that.
Thank you very much for that question, Ray. Now, I don't know if it's Ree or Ria Piggott. I think Ria, perhaps. So apologies if I have your name wrong there. Thank you for this riveting talk, and fancy visiting Berlin now and getting a copy of your book. Brilliant photos. And I think I know the question to this because you mentioned this in your last book, but the question is, any interest in aquariums? Brighton has the oldest one in the world, I believe, and a great place.
So yes, so in this book, in the British book, we didn't include aquariums, and I sort of regret not including them. In this book, we have included a couple of freestanding aquariums, one in Dusseldorf and one in the beautiful town of Stralsund, which is up in the northeast coast of Baltic coast of Germany. I've got to be honest, my knowledge of fish is not good. And I always feel really inadequate when I'm in an aquarium because I don't really know what I'm looking at and don't really understand them in the way that I would understand birds or reptiles or mammals. But nonetheless, the history of some of these places is really exciting. And there's no doubt that the brilliance of what's on offer there is worth focusing on. In a German context, I think there's a greater number, and I think there is a far greater number of really impressive zoo aquariums as opposed to freestanding ones by themselves. So lots of the zoos that are featured have big aquariums as part of their facilities, and often those are really substantial and impressive places, particularly in Berlin. Cologne is a wonderful aquarium, and various other places as well.
Thank you, John, and thanks for the aquariums question. Just some big shout outs for the Okapi, a couple of people saying they're wonderful and people don't appreciate them enough. And then the next question is from Ming Ung, who's another of our brilliant pupils at Bede Senior School. Have you ever been to a Chinese zoo? And if you have, what are your opinions on them and how do they compare to German zoos?
Thank you, Ming. That's a very good question. The answer is yes. Quite a few Chinese zoos because my son was living in China, so I had the pleasure of visiting him and also sneaking in loads of zoo visits as well, of course. And the answer is I absolutely loved Chinese zoos. I think there is a negative expectation of Chinese zoos in this country, which is possibly slightly racist in its starting point. And in fact, my experience of Chinese zoos, I'm sure there are many zoos which I haven't been to, but the ones I've been to were really pretty impressive. The visitors were very interested in what they were seeing and were as respectful and as well behaved as any European set of visitors would have been. And there was a genuine interest from the people running the zoos, I would say, in a range of interesting species, in biodiversity, shall we say. So certainly the Chinese zoos that I've visited were hugely impressive, mainly in Shanghai and Beijing and places around Shanghai. And I think there's a focus on enjoying animals and enjoying the presence of animals in Chinese zoos that perhaps I totally empathize with, and which perhaps is slightly less common in British zoos in particular, where a warm inner glow and a sense that you're doing a good thing by going to a zoo is expected to be enough, rather than the opportunity to actually see animals and enjoy seeing them and enjoy being quite close to them.
Thank you, and thank you, Ming, very much for that question. Thomas, I didn't comment. Quite interesting comment about the UK zoos rely on themed holiday events, and and German zoos have the luxury of external funding. Michael is absolutely disgusted by animatronic dinosaurs. Kevin's offering thanks for taking the books over to Europe, for giving that time and saving people on the postage, especially and this evening after a stressful day at work. I think you had a wonderful day at work, didn't you, John? Yeah. Oliver offering thanks. Thanks again for a brilliant talk. Just one more question. You mentioned German zoo directors. Do you think individuals have more of an influence on collections in Germany than in the UK?
Gosh, that's a good question. I don't know is the honest answer, but I do know that I think for anybody in any leadership position in a zoo, but also probably elsewhere as well, it's very easy to imagine that the person in charge can do whatever they want, can change things how they want, can organize things as they want, when the truth of the matter often is that they are constrained by all sorts of things that are weighing on them that an outsider wouldn't necessarily appreciate. And I think that's probably true in Germany as it is true in the UK. So the classic conversation, and there are one or two people on this call who are in leadership positions in zoos, and I'm sure they've had similar conversations, is when someone like me comes along and says, what you should do is X, Y, or Z. And their response will be, well, of course, I'd love to do that, but I can't because of this thing, that thing, and the other thing. And there are all those things that stop people from doing what it is ultimately they'd like to be able to do. One thing I would say, though, is I think there is the average, and this is a big sweeping generalization, but the average German zoo director is a much more scientifically focused person than the average British zoo director. And certainly in Britain, there's been what I personally think is a really, really negative move of having people from corporate backgrounds or backgrounds from the diplomatic service or something taking over running zoos, which is, to my mind, is an extraordinarily short sight. It'd be the equivalent of having somebody who had never had anything to do with a school coming in and being the head of a school. And I think that'd be a disaster. And I think it's a disaster when it happens in zoos in the UK. Whereas in Germany, the overwhelming majority of zoo directors are people with a scientific background, which is as it should be in my mind.
Thank you again for that great answer. We've got some praise from Jordan and from Malcolm for the mouse house and bird house at the Bronx Zoo. Mika just saying thank you, and our own Julia French also offering thanks. Thank you for the aquarium answer as well. Rebecca Withington thanking you. Thanks for the fantastic talk, John. What key elements of German zoos do you feel we in British zoos could learn from?
Gosh, well, I think, thank you, Rebecca. Rebecca's another of our keepers in the zoo here at Beeds. I think it's not so much we can learn from, but the thing we could only, if only we could have it, is that funding, because the fact that German zoos do get funding, usually, not always, but usually get significant funding from local cities or states, means that they don't have to spend time having cardboard Halloween figures in the meerkat enclosure, because they're not so dependent on money coming through the desk at the front desk. If only we had that situation here, things might be slightly different. And I'm sure a British zoo director hearing somebody like me moaning about Halloween and all that stuff would wholeheartedly agree, but would say they have to do it because without that they can't afford to pay their staff or sweep their paths or whatever it might be. So that funding is the thing that I wish we could take that from German zoos more than anything.
Thank you. Question from Malcolm: which zoo that you have never been to do you most want to visit?
Well, with a German specific focus, I mentioned that safari park earlier on in Hodenhagen. That's really the only significant one. In the rest of the world, I'm holding out on going to Singapore, where Doug used to work, because it's the last great place that I've not been to. And I feel, once I've been there, I feel a bit sad, because then I'm down to Gdansk or somewhere as the next big one to go to. So Singapore is the place that I'm holding out on a little bit.
But you don't want to go too soon, probably. There's a big thanks from Annie Bonheur, Oliver Muller as well. Thank you for that inspiring evening and all your work. I'm even more excited to get the book. My question: could you imagine to publish an additional best of the rest list on the website, maybe for the British Irish book, where you could at least mention smaller zoos and aquariums that you would recommend?
Yeah, I would like to do that, actually. And there are certainly in Germany, and particularly in Eastern Germany, there are lots of really interesting small places. In fact, when I said we crept up from 40 to 42, one of the reasons was there's one really lovely zoo right on the border with Poland in a place called Görlitz, which I'm probably pronouncing horribly. And it's tiny, but it's really lovely and it's really interesting and it's really done very professionally and fantastically. And I just wanted to include it because it was so great. And there's another really wonderful place in a place called Schönebeck near Magdeburg that has lots of fantastic rodents, and it's in a park and it's free to get in, and it just strikes me as a brilliant facility for the local people. And it's only a few miles away from the massive great zoo in Magdeburg, and yet they've still got this wonderful collection of rodents. And so we have snuck that one in anyway. So we've tried to get some of these little places in as well to give them some recognition for what they're doing. But yeah, absolutely, elsewhere too.
Thank you. A question from John Barkser. What is an animal you were shocked to actually see in person? What animal that you have not seen in person would you love to see?
Gosh, well, the shocked one is interesting. So I'm not sure if this is what John meant when he asked the question, but koalas, which are not uncommon in zoos, but are not massively common. In the UK, they're in 2 zoos, for example, and in Germany, they're in, 2 or 3. And seeing those in Duisburg Zoo, mentioned a few times, and I've always thought koalas are the most boring. They don't really do very much. They just sort of sit there and don't move and aren't particularly exciting. And I was at Duisburg Zoo quite recently, and it was a sunny day, and the koalas were out in the fresh air, and they were moving around. And it wasn't so much the koalas themselves, although they were beautiful and wonderful. It was the reaction of the visitors around me who were reacting with the excitement of people at a Taylor Swift concert at seeing these koalas in action. And it was that real reminder of just how people can be bowled over by an animal when they see them in this way. And similarly, and again, possibly slightly controversially, but Duisburg Zoo is famous for keeping dolphins. And I'm fairly ambivalent about keeping dolphins in captivity, I must admit, I'm whatever. But seeing the genuine excitement that people had at seeing dolphins close at Duisburg Zoo was an eye-opener, and I was a bit shocked by it. And it was quite exciting, actually, to see how people were so won over by seeing these animals.
Thank you, John, and thank you, John. Michael, loving Oliver's point about the extra kind of information. And then Thomas just commenting, seeing current trend of many British zoo directors' equivalents being business rather than animal focused. Many have little impact on animals' collections. We're actually on to the last question or two now. So Jordan, did you have as much resource available for this book as you did for the first one? Like
I'd say more, actually. And a German acquaintance, friend, was a bit sniffy. One of the things I've been very nervous of writing this book is it's that classic thing of it's okay to criticize your own family, but if someone else criticizes them, you want to punch them on the nose. And likewise, I'm very conscious that in writing this book, I might offend German people because I'm not German. My wife is half German, but I'm not German. And but I feel I know German zoos actually far better than I know British zoos. I've visited them far more than I've visited most British zoos. And there is a huge amount of resource out there in answer to Jordan's question. So German zoos are much better at the whole at publishing annual reports, in documenting what they've done, so that I've got lots of material that I could turn to burrow into exactly what was happening at Dresden Zoo in the 1970s, for example. So I was very lucky. I've got a room. I am very lucky because I've got a room at home just filled with old bits of what most people would regard as recycling material, but I would regard as priceless documents about the history of these places. And so I was able to turn to those things.
Thank you, John. And thank you so much to our wonderful audience and people who've posed questions. It's been a brilliant evening. I think we were pushing 90 at the peak. John, still almost half those people are still here and, listening to everything you have to say. So thank you. Can we give him one more digital round of applause and then we will wrap up for the evening? Thanks so much.
Thank you, Joe, for being MC. Joe's previous career was in the world of electronic music, so he's used to holding an audience in this way. So thank you, Joe. And thank you very much to everybody for coming along. I really appreciate it. For some people here, talking about zoos is what they like to do all the time anyway. And for some people here, it's possibly a slightly a thing they wouldn't normally want to spend an evening discussing. So I really do appreciate people coming along. And thank you very much for those of you who have ordered the books. I'm getting those out to you as soon as I can. And if you haven't ordered the book, obviously, that's what you should be doing. right away. So thank you very much, and good night to everybody for coming along. Thank you.